Introducing Dr. Cooper Schouten, Bees for Sustainable Livelihoods.
Right, hey everyone, my name's Cooper Schouten. I'm an academic, beekeeper, bee researcher at Southern Cross University. I lead a research group called Bees for Sustainable Livelihoods, and we manage projects with the Australian Centre for International Agricultural Research in different Pacific Island countries where they have Varroa. And so today we're going to be talking about managing Varroa, what's happened in the Pacific and some of the lessons we've learned from other industries, its impacts on bees, beekeepers and pollination. Sounds like a whole PhD thesis or 10, but we'll try and keep it simple. Big thanks to Tocal for the invitation, New South Wales DPI, RBIC, New South Wales AA, amateur beekeepers for the opportunity to be able to chat to you guys today. And it sounds like an awesome lineup, lots of great presentations and no doubt a lot of great information on Varroa mites. So these projects, these are invested in by the Australian government, but they're also co-invested by partner governments overseas. It's not industry levied monies necessarily, but these projects have been going on with ACR in Varroa mites. It's actually been investing in this for more than 2 decades. So some of ACR's initial investments are determining the difference between different types of Varroa mites. There's 6 different species. 2 of them are reproducing on Apis mellifera at the moment, and building capacity for some of our labs in Australia, developing different methods, looking at the reliability and sensitivity of different detection methods, lots of different stuff. So just keeping in mind that, Varroa research has actually been happening in this country for quite some time. It's not necessarily something we're just starting now. We've got a lot of lessons we can learn from other countries as well. But in Fiji, a bit of a context here, Varroa came in 2018. It was discovered the next year in both the major islands because there were people selling nukes across the countryside, and they weren't traced in lots of cases, and about a year after that, they went to transition to management. So it happened pretty rapidly in Fiji. They determined they were unable to eradicate it. They did try to slow it down. They had emergency declarations, but yeah, it's pretty much now on every single island in Fiji. Interestingly, chatting to beekeepers there and watching this process go down, lots of beekeepers at the start said that they weren't really seeing much of an impact. There's some mites in here, but I'm still making honey. That's kind of what they were saying. However, after about a year or 2, the mite populations really started to get to some pretty critical levels, and that's when beekeepers were actually saying, I thought my colonies were looking good, and then they're coming back and they basically just crashed. And a lot of beekeepers started losing significant numbers of beehives, up to 30-40% in some cases. They're losing a lot of colonies. And at the start, the focus was really about, okay, what can I buy to put in my box? I want to kill these mites. What I'm going to go buy, I'm going to stick it in there. That was the primary sort of thought. And monitoring for those mites was an afterthought. It was only, more recently that people have been starting to tap into relating what percentage of mites am I seeing in this beehive to what's actually happening in the box. So, at what point do I really need to treat with different types of treatments, and when and how. So that was kind of an interesting process to observe, particularly at the start. It took a little while for suppliers to get access to and register and have supply of miticides, and there had been some issues that, in other countries, some miticides are not as valuable because they might have resistance there, and sometimes they'll just send them miticides that are just about to expire. So if you're ordering anything, make sure you check the expiry date before it comes over. So an interesting one as well was chatting to beekeepers, explaining that and also the Biosecurity Authority of Fiji, their equivalent, DPI, saying, look, we're seeing more AFB, can you come out and check out what's going on? But really what was happening is they were observing a lot more parasitic mite syndrome. So that made looking for AFB pretty tiresome or confusing for a lot of beekeepers, because you're seeing this increase of AFB reporting, but not necessarily AFB confirmations or incidences, because the brood symptoms can look similar to other diseases with this PMS, but obviously the larva isn't going to rope out. So that PMS is characterised by low bee population, abnormal brood patterns, sunken chewing cappings. The larva can be slumped in the bottom of the cell or on the side of the cell, but doesn't rope out. But I'm sure other people would be chatting about that during the day. There's still pretty limited rotation. Getting there with it does take time. At the start, we're seeing a lot of beekeepers going out to Bunnings. Their equivalent, they don't have Bunnings, unfortunately. A lot of people just going to Bunnings and seeing what they can stick in beehives. So it can be pretty concerning when you see that. I know beekeepers, we want to, obviously the cheaper any management solution, the better, but there's also some things that could be optimized for the better of people, bees, and killing those mites. So later on, people started talking after that about, oh, well, they started learning about resistance issues and that sort of thing. So it's a bit of a continuum and a journey and that sort of thing, observing what was going on in Fiji. In Papua New Guinea, they don't have small hive beetle, they don't have American foul brood disease, but they do have two different mites, Tropolaelaps mites. There's 4 species of Tropi. 2 of them are reproducing on Apis mellifera, and managing these 2 mites in combination is not a lot of fun. We've trialed some experiments in Papua New Guinea around, how effective some of the treatments are that they're using, and different mechanisms for beekeepers to use non-chemical control methods, because a lot of people up there don't have access to money or those different types of equipment and the extension to be able to use them appropriately and that sort of thing too. But I'm not going to chew your ear off about that research. If you're interested in it, you can send me an email and I'll send you a copy if you're having any difficulties downloading it off the web. So lots of different pests and diseases of honeybees. You guys know about, more than 40 different pests and diseases. We need to be able to identify them, monitor them, and manage them. It's really, really critical. But the focus now is Varroa for a lot of people. But it's important to keep in mind that we're managing Varroa in the context of genetics and nutrition and ultimately in combination with many other interacting stresses, including other pests and diseases at the same time. It's important that we just sort of keep those things in mind. So as you guys all know, we are advocates for this. If you weren't, you wouldn't be sitting here listening to me right now. But, it's about those beekeepers around us too, that we're communicating. We are the advocates for this, that you can't just stick bees in a paddock and expect them to be healthy and happy and productive, particularly now that we have Varroa. I mean, it's not the end of the industry, but we will see the exiting of a lot of lazy beekeepers. That goes for pests and diseases that we do have in Australia and these ones here that we do not. So as I was mentioning, there's different types of mites, Tropolaelaps mites, and we've got Varroa sinai on Apis florea, Apis cerana, actually that's in far north Queensland, but not in lots of other places, tracheal mites, different types of viruses, that's a picture in the top right, and other types of mites. So we need to be aware of these. I think Sammy Giggins, legend, is going to be talking about some of these exotics as well as other endemics, but obviously we're going to be focusing on this one. So as you guys know and probably heard already, but these mites are basically feeding on the brood and the adult bees. They spread viruses, they make them weak and deformed, they don't live as long, the population gets smaller, they don't produce much honey, and if you just leave them there, they'll die. There's actually lots of viruses as well. I think Rod Burke's going to have a chat to you guys about viruses, but just keeping in mind there are some that we have here in Australia already, the ones with the asterisks there, and there are also ones that we do not have. They're the ones without the asterisks, and the ones that are red are particularly bad for bees, so we need to make sure we're keeping those out. How bad is a mozzie in comparison to how bad is a mosquito with malaria in it? You're talking about a pretty different problem. And interestingly, the viruses actually might influence what our economic thresholds are. So what percentage of mites infestation are you seeing that's actually causing that economic damage is going to be influenced by the amount of viruses and the prevalence of them and their distribution. So something to keep in mind for beekeepers. Killing those mites doesn't necessarily kill those bee viruses, so that's something to keep in mind. When we're talking about the effects of Varroa on honeybees, usually we just say that they're chewing on the fat body of the bee and they're spreading viruses, but they're actually doing heaps of other crazy things. There's some publications there that you can follow up. To summarize that slide, this is that slide summarized. So they're spreading, activating, exacerbating these viral infections, causing physiological deformities. They don't live as long. They're, more susceptible to pesticides in the environment because bees don't have a liver. They use their fat body tissue for that. They've got a diminished immune response. They're lighter. They're impaired. Their orientation abilities go down. Their ability to communicate and produce royal jelly goes down. So these mites are doing lots of different things. It's not just feeding on them and spreading viruses. It's quite difficult to be a bee with all these things going on. But in saying that, the effects of all of these different things and the effects of Varroa on individual bees do not necessarily translate to similar effects on the whole colony, because as we know, honeybees are a super organism. They're social creatures. They live in complex interactions with one another and the environment. What we do know for the research is that when you've got lots of mites, your colonies are going to be significantly lighter, less bees, less food resources, particularly coming out of colder winter climates. for those of you in colder areas. It can exacerbate and spread diseases between colonies, because if you've got really weak colonies, well, they're more likely to be robbed out, and if they've got AFB, it can spread around. We know that if you just stick them out there and leave them in a paddock, they will die between 2 to 3 years maximum. High infested colonies significantly increase their chances of dying. Well, that's pretty obvious, but in combination with other things, it's not ideal. Large proportion of the worker population are just sitting in there picking their noses. They're not feeling too good. They're not going out for work. You can have significantly higher rates of queen supersedure. So when you're requeening, you can actually have quite a lot of difficulties, significantly higher rates of that not being successful. So having low mite numbers before you actually requeen is going to increase your chances of that being successful potentially. And as we chatted about, parasitic mite syndrome, main thing there is it can, for some people, make AFB diagnosis a little bit more difficult. Some of the effects on beekeeping businesses. So there's been a fair few studies. Most of these studies are pretty old. They look at lots of different types of information, so we take them with a bit of a grain of salt. But generally, we know that Varroa is going to increase significantly the amount of management, monitoring, and replacing costs associated with Varroa losses. So having more people out there knowing what's going on in those boxes in terms of where your mite numbers are at. In New Zealand, there was a study there in 2008. They had increased costs of about $40 to $50 per hive. So translate that to today's dollar in AU dollars, that's about $50 to $60 a hive. There was a study that showed for the average size Australian bee business, costs could increase by 30%. Keep in mind the average is probably perhaps not necessarily the best number to use. I mean, the average number for bee businesses in Australia is 300, so or 299 in 2018. So if you've got that many beehives, that number kind of makes sense. But for other players, obviously take that number with a grain of salt. In New Zealand and the US, we had a 50 to 60% reduction in hobbyist and part-time commercial operators. And that's pretty important because they play a big part in the industry, having a lot of fun doing what they're doing. It's an important part for some people, part of their income, and it's worth about $173 million to the economy. However, impacts on honey production are actually pretty difficult to discern. There's not a lot of research out there that shows that a clear pathway when these mites turn up, that you've either got major declines in honey production. Some actually show that there's actually little difference, which is quite interesting. So what we do know is that Varroa is a leading cause of colony losses globally, particularly in USA and New Zealand. We know that management options can't eliminate Varroa, so once we got it, we just got to keep it at levels that are below those damaging economic threshold levels, basically. So once it's there, these treatments are, if you read the packet, it doesn't say 100% effective. It says something like 98% effective. So you've still got a few mites in there, and obviously a lot of them move around through drift and beekeepers moving stuff around. So in New Zealand, they've seen hive numbers remaining pretty steady after Varroa mites came, but the number of registered businesses was cut in half. So that's pretty interesting. In the USA, there was little change. So this is actually a bit confusing, because if you're reflecting on what I'm saying that Varroa is the leading cause of colony losses globally, but there's not clear research that says that beehive numbers and honey production change that much. Why is that? If Varroa losses are so high, why doesn't this have a dramatic impact on hive numbers and honey production statistics? Well, believe it or not, beekeepers are really good at making bees. They make splits, they make up nukes, they're making queens and packages. And the reality is that most of beehives and honey production, most of beehives is owned by a very small percentage of, highly skilled operators that are going to be out there learning a lot about these mites and applying different integrated pest management solutions. But in saying that, you still got to replace those colonies that are lost. And that means a significant increase in your costs of production. So some of the impacts on pollination industries, you guys know, we've got 35 pollination dependent crops in Australia in particular. So 65% of our crops, we need some honeybees there for those growers to remain viable and have optimized production systems. And that's worth about $14.2 billion to the Australian economy. Keeping in mind that study was done 5 years ago, and that study was looking at data from 2015. So that number is actually probably much greater now. There's been a lot of crops going in the ground since then. There's actually very few scientific studies investigating the impacts of Varroa on pollination. It's pretty hard to do studies that look at mites and then how that impacts on bees and then how that impacts a colony and then how that impacts on a crop. Actually, quite a long bow to sort of draw there in terms of connections. It's pretty hard to research that, but the research that is out there, and there's probably a lot more than what I've cited here, obviously, but generally speaking, bees from colonies that are highly infested with mites are going to be less efficient pollinators. As we know, they're not living as long, then they've got impaired orientation abilities, possibly due to shorter flower visits and lower tendency to collect pollen. So there is a few studies out there that show that. You've probably heard already, the Varroa is going to progressively kill about 95% of Australia's feral bees within the first 3 to 4 years. We've seen that in other countries as well, particularly in the USA and in Europe. And as a result of that, lots of growers are out there getting a free pollination service. It's incidental pollination, and as a result of that, there's actually perhaps a low level of awareness around the importance of pollination by honeybees than might be expected, given it's important because we've got so many feral bees in our Australian environment. We've got beautiful flora and great environment for bees to support themselves, essentially. So when those feral colonies die, growers are going to need more bees than they already have to supplement those losses, and some marginal growers that are not seeking bees at the moment will probably need to start getting bees in. So what does that mean? Greater demand, lower supply, increase in cost of production of pollination services. A couple of studies out there show that the price paid for commercial hives will raise between $70 to $110, so that was in 2010. So there's your 2023 stats, anywhere up to $160 increase. There was another study by Ryan. I actually emailed the guy the other day to get the report. He said it could go up by a total of 440 per hive. So obviously very variable depending on crops, but obviously the key thing here, and as seen in New Zealand, is that it's going to increase, particularly in the first 5 years, anywhere up to 100% in those costs for rental hives and pollination. So what we know, prices paid for pollination is going to go up, no doubt about it. There's a lot of different crops. Different crops have different dependencies on having honeybees there. And obviously those crops that are more dependent are going to need more bees to be on them, essentially. And then this slide just looks at the value. So the value of pollination dependent production, so some of those top crops, and obviously almonds, apples, oranges. Sorry guys that the text is so small here, but yeah, just keeping in mind when you're thinking about business model, which crops are you visiting, which crops are most needing honeybees there, and which ones, obviously there's a lot of growers that are out there, essentially. So both beekeepers and growers are going to need to be proactive. So I just wanted to emphasize that, we've seen in New Zealand, for example, that some of the stone fruit growers there really didn't pay to have more bees on their crops. And as a result, they waited until their business models were almost non-viable because they just weren't producing the crop that they needed to get those margins that they required. So both beekeepers and growers need to be proactive in ensuring they've got adequate pollination services happening. Just to switch the tone a little bit to a topic called chemical resistance. So I just wanted to show you this. This is after Jack and Ellis paper that came out in 2021. Just really highlighting the importance of being aware, basically, that chemical resistance is a real problem. So on the left-hand side, you've got a number of different countries there, and at the top, you've got different types of key miticides that are used to kill mites. And you can see that in some of those countries, you've got people using those chemicals and paying good money for them, putting them in a beehive, and the Varroa mites just basically laugh at you. They're not going to be as impacted by those treatments as they should be. So that's obviously not an ideal situation. If you don't believe me, these are some of the publications that you can follow up on, and that's just where data exists. So this is potentially happening in other countries and at a greater extent, but it's just not necessarily recorded. What causes chemical resistance? Using unregistered chemical controls, or stripping out to Bunnings and getting whatever you think you want, just putting in a beehive. Using less than the recommended dose, and I'll just cut this strip up and divide it between different hives, save some money. Using the same chemical every time, so just using that. And keep in mind, the chemical class, not the name of the packet. The packet or the brand could be different brand names, but they're using the same chemical. So make sure it's the chemical that you're actually the active chemical in there that's actually been changed. And not removing strips, so just putting them out there, basically just not reading the instructions on them. It is pretty simple to just follow the instructions. I do anticipate beekeepers are going to trial and experiment things, particularly for some of the organics, which is great. But yeah, there's a lot of safety considerations for both people, bees and bee products that really needed to be taken seriously. Otherwise you can impact on those things. And essentially the process is that, you know, if you're under treating or doing any of these things, you'll have some percentage of the mites that just get a little bit of a taste for that chemical, and they don't die and they go on to reproduce, and you just essentially end up with more mites that don't care about those chemicals. So something that we hopefully can avoid here in Australia. So I put it to you all, I asked you guys the question, what will the known Varroa chemical resistance look like in the year 2033? Because in New Zealand, there's resistance been shown for all 4 of those major chemical classes. These other countries in the Pacific, including Australia, we don't know yet, but it's up to us as beekeepers. So essentially, resistance issues are real, and it's up to us. Key take-home messages: you can't expect honeybees to be healthy, happy, productive if you just stick them in a paddock. You guys are the advocates for this. I know you know that, but we need to communicate that to other beekeepers. There are major pests and diseases in and around Australia, and we need to be able to identify, monitor, and manage those pests and diseases. So just because we got Varroa doesn't mean we take our finger off the pulse with our biosecurity and all the great work that's been done there. And also, importantly, us learning about these things as individuals. Killing bees doesn't kill bee viruses. Varroa will increase the cost of production, but honey and colony numbers may remain stable. They might. Varroa will increase the demand for bees and therefore the prices paid for pollination, no doubt about it. Beekeepers and growers are both going to need to be proactive. And sorry about that Varroa mite being on top of that text, but Varroa is not the end of beekeeping. And it says there, unless you're lazy, it's just a new way of beekeeping. Anyway, lovely to be able to communicate and chat to you guys about Varroa. It's something I'm very passionate about. And yeah, I hope you're all having a great day.